In this lesson, we'll talk about HSL curves, as HSL curves allow for precise and creative color grading. And we'll be working with this Canon clip. These are my project settings, exactly the same as for all other lessons. And my input color space is set to Canon Cinema Gamut Canon Look 2, as this is how this clip was shot. And here on the first note, I've only adjusted the exposure a little bit. This is before and after. Then at the very end, I did a little bit of sharpening. Let me zoom in to show you. This is before and after, and I did it by going to blur and by decreasing the blur radius. So I went from 0.50 to 0.46. And then I have put all HSL curves names separately as parallel nodes, and I will be going through all of them in a second. So let's go to our curves. And here first we have our custom curves that you have familiarized yourself with before. So let's move on to hue versus hue, and let's select our hue versus hue node. And basically, when I drag my curve up and down, I'm able to change the hue of any color of the clip, like this. But we can also do it selectively. So here, if I want to change the hue of the sky, and in order to select only the hue of the sky, I can simply click on it, on the clip, and then a point will appear on my curve, and I can modify it. So I can move it up and down. I will move it up then. So this way, I would change the color of the sky from blue to more of a teal blue, like this. It's a little bit quirky. And this is before and after. So it already changes how our clip looks quite significantly. Then I can, for example, select the green color of the trees over here, and I can do the same. I can change the hue of the trees. We can make them look more green or more yellow, like this. And now let's move on to another node, that is our hue versus saturation. And here we'll be adjusting the saturation of the selected hue. So here let's focus on this red sleeve, as I think it's a bit overly saturated. So we can basically fix it with this curve. So let's select it. And now down here, let's push this point down a bit. And look what happened. This is before and after. A huge difference. Now let's move on to hue versus luminance. And here we can adjust the luminance of the selected hue. So when we move the curve up, the whole clip gets brighter, and when we move it down, it gets darker. So let's select the sky color again to create a point on the curve. And now when I move my point up, the sky gets very bright, and when I move it down, it gets darker. And I will maybe darken it a bit as I prefer it. Now let's move to the luma versus saturation. And here we can increase or decrease the saturation of the shadows, midtones, or highlights separately. So when I push this curve down on the very left, I will desaturate my clips in the shadows, like this. Let's reset it. And when I do it on the right, I will desaturate my clip in the highlights. And here what I will do, I will create an additional point in the midtones, and I will push it up just a touch. Then I will decrease the saturation in the shadows and the highlights a bit. And this is before and after. A very, very tiny difference, but decreasing the saturation in the shadows and highlights make the image look more natural, in my opinion. Now let's move on to the saturation versus saturation. And this curve allows us to decrease or increase the saturation depending on the saturation on the image in the shadows, midtones, and highlights. This is how it works. So here again, I will decrease the saturation of the most saturated parts of the clip in the shadows and highlights. and we can increase them in the midtones. And now let's move on to the last HSL curve called saturation versus luma. And here we can increase or decrease the luminance depending on the saturation of the clip. And it works like this. So I will maybe just decrease it a tiny bit in the highlights, and I will push it up in the midtones. And this is before and after. Again, just a slight difference. Sometimes it's all about very, very subtle changes. And this is our clip before using HSL curves and after.